Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. And I am thrilled to have the honor of moderating this discussion with three just really remarkable people. Angelique Power, who heads the Skillman Foundation in Detroit, Crystal Haling, who leads the Libra Foundation in Northern California, and Don Chen, who heads the Surdna Foundation here in New York City. Three very different organizations, different legacies, different timelines, and those varying perspectives will really add a lot of depth to our discussion today. Our topic today about centering people and communities and how we can reimagine philanthropy to do that really links to RPA's new mission to accelerate philanthropy in pursuit of a just world, as well as some of the core values that we have focused on over the coming years, including, although it's interesting that one wants to say this directly in these days, that we believe as an organization that philanthropy can help create a more just world. We also believe that philanthropy has a responsibility to pursue equity. And we believe in centering people and communities, which is really the theme for today's webinar. As Caroline mentioned, a lot of these ideas and a lot of the learnings, including what we have learned from leaders like the ones on this call today, are going to be available for everyone in RPA's first book called Reimagined Philanthropy, which should be available toward the end of June, and we're excited for that. This is the first of a series of webinars linked to that book, and we hope that all of you will be able to join future webinars, and that you'll all get a chance to have your questions answered, although there are many more of you on this call than there's likely to be time for questions, but we will do our best. You'll get a recording of the webinar, and you'll get an email with a digital copy of the book once it's launched. While you're listening, please send questions along using the Q&A feature on Zoom, or if you prefer the chat box, if possible, Q&A so that it's all in one place. Caroline and James will be monitoring that. So with that, I'm going to jump in to our topic today. We want to talk about three living case studies of making change and reimagining philanthropy with the work that's underway in the three foundations whose leaders are with us today. We also want to look to the future of philanthropy and what lessons we can draw as we all collectively try to reimagine philanthropy. We're particularly interested in the idea of having a longer time horizon in philanthropy, which still in some ways feels awfully reactive, but has an opportunity to think about foresight and to think about a future timeline that's measured in decades and not in annual giving cycles. So with that, I want to talk to these leaders, all of whom have been transforming their organizations over the last 5 years. And I'm going to start with Angelique. So welcome and thank you. The Skillman Foundation is in the process of co-designing a new strategic framework with Detroit youth and their champions. So how do these voices of youth and of Gen Z orient your reimagination for a better future? How do they literally also show up in your planning? Tell us about that process, please.
Sure. Thank you, Melissa. It's so lovely to be here with my colleagues. I'm excited to hear what they have to say, as always. So, maybe I should start just by explaining who Gen Z is. This is a term I think that people are hearing more and more about, but these are people that were born between 97 and 2013. They are between 11 and 27 years old. I have a Gen Zer in my home, as some of you might also, and I'm lucky enough to work with many Gen Zers. Detroit is a young city. Our average age is 35, so we are a sparkling Black and brown city with lots of young people. More about Gen Z, they're the largest generation in the world. They're a third of the world population. They're a quarter of the US population. We've spent so many years talking about, 2040 and the emerging majority of folks of color, and they've arrived in Gen Z. 48% are people of color. 1 in 5 identify as LGBTQIA+. 1 in 3 know someone who's gender non-binary. And beyond that, they are intersectional in their identities and in their analysis of issues and potential solutions. They have seen pandemics and political strife and have led racial uprisings. They spend money in places that match their values. And they organize themselves extremely differently. So even when I was in Chicago, and I've been in Detroit now for almost 2 years, but when I was in Chicago, I was watching this generation because of how they structure themselves in social impact. Many of them are not forming nonprofits. They form workers' cooperatives instead, collaboratives. They are non-hierarchical. You'll often see several directors of an organization instead of one. And when I was watching the uprisings that were the largest in US history, I saw Gen Z in the lead, in particular Black and Brown Gen Zers, calling for wholesale systems change over incrementalism. And I said to myself, I'm going to spend the rest of my career moving obstacles out of their way, getting capital to them so they can fix our very old problems that we have created and not been able to fix. I've been in Detroit for almost 2 years and have led a community-rooted strategic planning process, which I'm happy to talk more about in a little bit. But that centered Gen Zers, centered their perspective on what's happening in schools right now, what education systems need to change, and what philanthropic systems need to change. I have a youth council of Gen Zers. They are grant makers. They have created their own rubrics and criteria for making grants. They used ranked choice voting to make their decisions. And they contacted everyone directly and over the phone or Zoom to tell them about the grants. In terms of reporting, they suggested that they post on social media and that would probably suffice. We're also really interested in getting their voices in the policy arena. The Mackinac Policy Conference is the biggest conference that's focused on policy in Michigan. It's happening in a couple of weeks again. And we've now brought our Gen Zers with us because they are being discussed without them in the room. They are now in front of policymakers and business titans to help direct them. And the final thing I'll say about that is that Michigan has just turned blue for the first time in 40 years. And much of that is because Gen Zers are voting. They are showing up, not because they're beholden to a party, but because they have fidelity to policies and practices that match their authenticism and their feelings around integrity. So yeah, don't sleep on Gen Z. That's the shorthand.
Great, thank you. That is really phenomenal to hear, and it's clearly linked to one of the key themes that we want to talk about today, which is how do we reimagine making progress on racial justice. So thank you very much for that. Don, I know that CERDNA is on a journey toward becoming a learning organization in service of grantees, rather than having grantees serve the foundation. And that's an evolution in relationships, changes in reporting. How has this evolution moved beyond financial resources? What does that mean about reporting? How does that, play into your vision for building racial justice?
Sure. And thanks for having me and all of our wonderful panelists here. I think we had a head start very early on in our formation. The CERDNA Foundation is a family foundation that's been around for 106 years. And we were started by a gentleman named John Andrus, And the reason why we're not the Andrus Foundation and why we're the Surdna Foundation is because he was a modest person, demonstrated humility, didn't want to put his name in lights, so he spelled his name backwards and put that name on the foundation. And that has really been one of the values that we've taken forward over time. Even when in the 1980s, when the foundation hired professional staff, there was always an ethos of really listening and trying not to get a big head because we had a lot of resources to deploy, and really trying to be responsive to folks in the field. And that spanned from, grant seekers like myself back in the 90s who were working on environmental justice to people working on community development. We always felt that the Surdna Foundation really listened to us and cared about what we thought. And so now that I'm running the foundation, I get to take the foundation through its next iteration of this type of work. You mentioned beyond the money, the phrase beyond the money. It's interesting because Ed Skloot, who was president 2 presidents ago before me, published a report called Beyond the Money. And it was really one of his signature themes during the time of his presidency, which is, foundations can do a lot more than just write a check. And the way in which we really try to implement that is, there's several ways actually. I'll just give you 2 examples. One is, first and foremost, we really try increasingly to really authentically partner with the field. We call this high touch grant making. Some folks call it, within Surdna call it, being in right relationship with folks, deep partnerships with people in the field. And we take that very seriously because so many of us come from the field. We know that after this job, we're going to go back out into the field. So we really try to make sure that we're taking steps that really reflect priorities that community leaders, residents, movement leaders are prioritizing. And one of the ways in which we in listening to folks and really identifying demands, not just individual, from individual organizations, but across the field, we found that racial justice organizations, movement organizations tend to really need certain things. They need help with fundraising. Many of them need help with financial management. Many of them need help with setting up technology systems, digital security. So one role that we've sought to play is to work with providers who can provide those types of services, training, and basically invite cohorts of grantees to come and learn about those things. And we pay for all of that. It's just one way in which we can serve folks in a way that is really responsive to the field. Another example, a second example, is a change in the way we've done, what we conventionally call monitoring, evaluation, reporting, that set of activities. As all of us know, reports are not required by the IRS. This is something that became part of the culture of foundations way back when. I remember as a grant seeker, as a person running an organization, we used to spend so much time filling out these reports and writing 20-page theses about the work that we had done, and then FedExing them at like 11:30 at night over to whatever foundation it was. And we and many foundations have really started asking ourselves, why do we ask for these? Do we read them? What are we going to do with the data? Do we, what good will it do to collect all this paper, all this information? And so in the several years I've been at Surdna, we've really talked with our grantee partners and fellow funders and others in the field to really try to understand, what is the purpose of this type of reporting, data collection, and learning? Should we do it at all? After picking up some tools from folks who've been doing equitable evaluation, folks who have developed tools related to trust-based philanthropy, we've decided to create, we discovered that folks in the field, whether they're, community organizers or policy folks or what have you, they all have questions too. They all want to collect data. They want to, have folks conduct analyses about what's happening out there. And so we've decided to contribute to those efforts by first of all, co-designing our evaluation efforts with folks in the field so that we're all, exploring the same types of questions together. And we're investing in the folks who collect the data, analyze it, put it out there so that we can contribute knowledge to the field. It's much more of a true partnership in evaluation than, someone looking over your shoulder, which is how it sometimes feels when you have a more conventional approach. So those are two examples, and I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. I think I speak on behalf of many of us on this call who have received grants over their career, that it always feels like somebody looking over the shoulder. How could it not, right? But what you're talking about is putting yourself in the position where you are sharing with the world what your grantees have learned, as opposed to what you have brilliantly figured out as a solution. And that's really remarkable, Don. Thank you. So, and I want to just ask Angelique real quick, if you don't mind. Don mentioned that Cerna is over 100 years old. Crystal's, the Foundation Crystal leads is probably the youngest on this call. How old is the Skillman Foundation, may I ask, please?
We are 63 years old.
Okay, then.
In between.
Yeah, exactly. So Crystal, I want to ask you how you keep yourself, your board, your organization, your community, your grantees, your partners from feeling overwhelmed by all of the converging intersectional challenges, right? And I also want to ask, mostly because that would help my mental health, but I would also like to ask how you position Libra's philanthropy to rethink and address these intersectional problems to get us to a more just future.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you for inviting me to join this conversation. I always love it anytime I'm in the room with Angelique and Don and you, Melissa, because it's always going to be a rich conversation where we're trying to push ourselves. So, I guess at some level, Melissa, I might just start out by saying that I kind of will listen to Audre Lorde and her, quote that there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And so to some extent, that intersectionality is the gift that we have, not the struggle that we have. For me to be, when I took on this role and I interviewed with the Nick and Susan Pritzker and they're for adult kids who are the board of the Libra Foundation. I said to them, listen, I'm going to show up as a Black woman with a lot of experience in philanthropy, with a lived experience as the daughter of a civil rights activist, as somebody who has had the privilege of going to Ivy League schools for my education, but have also, grew up in a very working lower middle class family and have had the struggles of understanding what it's like to not have a lot of wealth privilege in this society. So all of those things are all of who I am, and that's what I'm going to bring to this role. And that's the exciting part of the work, because the program areas, we work in gender, we work in criminal justice reform, what we've now renamed as community safety, and we work in climate justice. So all of those issues, and I used to joke with the family that there's a little bit of when we would talk to people about those three program areas, some people would say, oh, those are really different. And some people would say, oh, those issues are really interestingly connected. And I think we really feel that they are interestingly connected. So the Libra Foundation, and I think there is an article in here, Melissa, to be written about the ability of foundations who do not bear the name of their donors to be a little bit more on the edge, to be a little bit more willing to take risks. And the Libra Foundation is named the Libra Foundation because both of my donors are Libras. And they also really feel that they are the kind of people who believe in the scales of justice, which is what Libra is. So that is, that's where we are as a foundation. We are really, I would say, very committed to thinking about the ways in which all of these issues connect. So I'm just going to give you a couple little examples, about sort of how we see this work coming together. It's really interesting when you think about climate justice work, and many people don't really realize that, since 1996, we've been able to be guided by the HEMES principles, which really are those key founding principles of the climate justice, environmental justice movement that talk to us about kind of the key principles: be inclusive, focus on bottom-up organizing, let people speak for themselves, focus on solidarity and mutuality, build relationships amongst ourselves, and commit to our own self-transformation. Those are really some of the founding principles of what climate justice is. And so that's a really important part of our work. We're also really grounded in, because we work in gender justice, reproductive justice, which since 1994 was the creation of the reproductive justice movement and was really looking at the intersection of who we are as multi-ethnic, multi-identity people, and the importance of not just focusing on choice, but focusing on access, which is really a question of saying it's not just an individual choice, but it's about a community capacity to have access. So all of these movements really began to think about how do we recenter communities and not just individuals. There's a real flow through of all of these pieces where we're saying to ourselves that we are not healthy and whole just as individuals, but we're healthy and whole when our communities are healthy and whole. And that's a lot of what we bring to the work that we do with Libra, is to say, how do we work with organizations that are about building community capacity, about building political voice and community voice, and really addressing that community and will to define what a healthy community is, and then to enact and enable it. So I'll come back to it as we talk about these things, but that's really what we see as being the intersectional approach, is focusing on community, building capacity and voice, and us being in mutual partnership with our grantees, not sitting on high, as both Don and Angelique talked about, sort of the old traditional philanthropy idea, which is we've got a strategy, we're going to implement it down on top of people, but really being shoulder to shoulder on the same side of the table, not on opposing sides of the table. And that's really where we see the real richness of how to be in engagement and community.
That's very powerful. Thank you. Thank you. This is really great. I want to move now to some questions, if I may. Some of them will be for all three of you, some of them for one or more of you. So here you go. I wanted to ask about the experiences that the three of you have had as you have been reimagining your foundation and its philanthropy in all senses, how that change management process works with a board. And, two of you have family-led boards. Angelique, I believe that you have an independent board. Is that correct? So I'd love to hear, maybe first, Angelique, can you say a little bit about how it's been with your board and how the composition maybe of your board has also changed over this period?
Yes. And now I'm inspired to have like a Pisces foundation. I never knew that that's how Libra got its name. A board is a subset of a community. And so I think for me, entering into the Detroit community from Chicago was a really important aspect of starting at this foundation. These are very different cities, and Detroit has had an extractive relationship with outsiders. So entering into Detroit, I came with a jersey instead of a cape, and spent a lot of time listening to the visionaries that are in the community. And the board understood that was an important part of actually integrating and understanding what my job is. The board also, had been leading this foundation that is not family-led, but has a really substantial, robust reputation in Detroit. It has focused on Detroit for 60 years. It has focused on neighborhoods, often when others have not, and has weathered the storm of emergency management, has weathered the storm of a city in bankruptcy, and has kept a laser focus on young people. So that said, coming in 2021, trying, to learn the lessons of the racial justice summer and what the pandemic has taught us, there was a mandate that I was clear about, that we're not just trying to reinvent education systems, but we're trying to reinvent philanthropic systems too. So there cannot be any preciousness around what we will look at, what we will aim to fix, and what we won't. So having that agreement on the front end with the board and having them be excited about that process was really important. We spent a year walking our mission, and part of that was taking these words that are overused and toothless and misunderstood, and taking them out of the lexicon and into our actual operations. So racial equity, that used to be a term that people were scared to use, and now it's interchangeable with a diversity. And I'm getting statements from like Sephora about racial equity. So it was really important for the board to understand, what does this mean? For us, that was conducting a racial equity audit where we looked at where every penny we've spent has gone for the last 3 years by race. Our grants, our operating budget, and a tougher nut to crack, the endowment. And then not only bringing that in front of the board, but agreeing to release that publicly so that we could begin to shift the dynamic where the board is, at the top of the hierarchy in terms of power, and restore that really to where true power is, which is in community. There's no accountability in philanthropy. So these are tools of accountability that we could collectively create. So studying racial equity, making it real, studying racial justice, understanding that means solutions come from communities of color. They are leading the movements towards systems change. And then also understanding systems change. That's another word that is like thrown around, and it's actually extremely complicated, especially in a city like Detroit, where there are overlapping education systems that are working. So we've been going through a process, whether it was bringing in Lori Villarosa, who actually came and spoke to our board at one point from PRE, having a trustee retreat where we really reviewed our mission, vision, and values and updated them collectively, and going through some practices where we kind of combed through our work and aligned it more tightly with our values. And we added our first Gen Zer to the board, which has been helpful to us too.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you. So, Crystal, I'll turn to you. You have a board which is a nuclear family, right? So, tell me about how that has played out, and what you see as the future.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is really wonderful is when the family that I work with is, the parents and their adult children. And the boardroom is really a place where they wanted to come together and be able to talk about and share and learn together about some of the values that they know that they share. And some values they share, but they may not prioritize each of them exactly in the same way. Mm-hmm. And so part of what working on a foundation board together allows us to do is to really learn and grow together. And I think that is the most important thing, is this is a board that is committed to being changed by this work. Mm-hmm. Not we know what we're doing and we're going to, we want you as executive director to carry this out. I also want to say that Don mentioned the whole concept of trust-based philanthropy and this movement that I think is very important and very powerful right now. And really, we have to continue to carry this through. There is no trust-based philanthropy in terms of a foundation working with grantees if you don't have a board that trusts its staff. So one really important element of this was that we had a board that was willing to say, let us relinquish a lot of the decision-making control to the staff, because we've hired a staff that is primarily people of color, people with lived experience on these issues, and let's allow them to lead the work that we're doing. And the board is supporting and co-signing that work. And then once we're in that work, we're learning together about what it is that we need to understand and how this work is changing in communities. So it's a process of us being changed, of us being led by people who actually have the expertise in the issue, as opposed to expecting that the board's job is to become experts before they then make decisions about what the grant making looks like. We also, take this really to heart. We went on a site visit, a field trip together to Montgomery, Alabama, to the Equal Justice Initiative, to really understand, if you do criminal justice reform, community safety work in this country, it's really important to understand that, that historical basis of much of what we think of now as the carceral system, of the policing system, to the early slave patrols, to the police in the South who, implemented, a real white racist terrorist threat on Black communities. I just had the opportunity to go visit Tulsa, Oklahoma, and to understand the way in which the police were part and parcel of, robbing Black people of their wealth, of the legacy of lynching in this country. Those are things that's really important to understand on a visceral level, to sit and to stand in Montgomery, Alabama, and understand what land you are on. Is really powerful and changes how we experience this work. And so that's the kind of activity that I think it's important for boards to engage in. Too often, I think the fear of not knowing is a fear that boards are ruled by but don't want to say. Yeah. And I think that the ability and the willingness to say, we don't know the right answer to everything, and maybe we're going to learn and be changed as we do this work. It's a powerful invitation. And I think that if you ask our board, did we expect that we would be doing this work in this way when they hired me 6.5 years ago? I think they would say we had no idea. This is what we were going to be doing in this way. And I think they would say we feel really proud to be on this learning journey together. And we feel like we have done more remarkable work than we ever imagined possible. So I think giving ourselves that openness to be changed, to learn, to build powerful relationships with people who don't look and sound like us, to be on the ground in communities that we didn't grow up in. All of this is the invitation, I think, to this systems change work and this kind of rethinking what philanthropy can look like.
Yeah, great. I love the word invitation. And you made 2 points that really in particular resonate with me. One is what Brian Stevenson always talks about, being proximate. Just get up and go. And the other is the idea that you don't have to be the one who knows the answers. And some of us, Crystal and Angelique and I, were in a conversation earlier in or late April, talking about how so many of us were trained that it was our job to know the answer. And many people on the boards of these organizations were also trained that that was their job and that was the behavior they needed to exhibit. And so unlearning is part of what we have to help one another with, I think. So Dawn, you're the family that is part of the leadership at the board level of the Certain Foundation is a multi-generational family. You must be in the 5th, 6th generation of adults lots and lots of people, not all of whom are on the board, but all of whom have a sense of connection. How does that work in your world and in doing this kind of work?
Sure. Well, we have a fantastic board. I love working with our board. It's interesting because we are on our 5th and 6th generation, which means that there are a lot of people in the family. And if you look at the family tree, I think there's something like 500 living descendants of John Andrus and Julia Dykeman Andrus. And it's so large that we actually hire a search firm to go through applications to join the board, and we're able to recruit really high caliber people, not just in terms of their accomplishments, but also in terms of their compatibility with the board and the agreement with the values and the mission of the organization. So that's been a real blessing. It's been really fantastic. Crystal, you mentioned trust. One thing I quickly learned as soon as I took on this role was that the board has a culture and has had a culture for decades of trusting the staff. There's a mantra on this board: the staff are the experts. We're the board, we play a governing role and whatnot, but really the staff are the experts. And that's been the case, since I was a grantee and today now that I'm at the foundation. And the way we go through these changes and the evolution, the focus on racial justice and really trying to implement the work well is in a really deep and authentic way. Or at least we strive towards that. The board has always been about deep engagement. In fact, when I first started, they asked me what I really wanted from them, and I said engagement. And it was very easy for them to engage with the staff and with me because that's what they're already doing. So the certain board members tend to really like to dig deep. We just to give you some examples, when about maybe 8 years ago, the conversation began on impact investing. It took years, frankly, for the board to go through discussions about how to do it, whether to do it. There was a retreat, I believe, in Minnesota, where they spent a couple days talking about the ins and outs and then really honing what the priority should be. And we published that because we like to be really open about our thought process and how we arrive at decisions. So that's characteristic of how this board likes to do its work. The latest iteration is the board has been really trying to embrace its governance role more and more, and really delineate its role from the staff's role. So roles and responsibilities are really important. The late Gwen Walden, who was on our board, she was senior partner at Arabella Advisors. She dubbed this process our strategic governance planning process. Mm-hmm. So it's really, it's like strategic planning, but it's for the board and it's about governance. And through that process, we've identified some categories of big priorities, big chunky things within the foundation that the board is going to tackle, including how we do our spending, what we do with our endowment. Should we do more than our current carve out for impact investing and do something more ambitious? There's also discussions about how we focus more on learning and less on day-to-day approval of grants. So the board's really engaged in that. So not to say everything is completely 100% great all the time, because we're all human. We all have to work through challenging things. There are occasionally disagreements, but I think because this board really cares about trying to be accountable in an unaccountable sector, really trying to pay attention to what peers are doing, recognizing the civic responsibility that we all have or should have. They really try to embody what's considered to be best practice. And as they do that, they really, like to dig in and learn what those best practices are, learn from folks like you, Melissa, over at RPA, and Crystal and Angelique, and understand how Cerna can continue to evolve in that direction.
Thank you all. That's really helpful. I want to ask the same question, but about the program staff as opposed to the board, right? I think the idea that the program staff are the experts and that reassures the board is a model that many foundations have embraced for a long time. And if we're talking, though, about ceding power and supporting communities and their leaders as opposed to imposing solutions, that shifts the role of the program team and others in the organization. How do you work that through? Again, in a world in which many people who are in program roles in foundations trained themselves based on an expectation that they're supposed to be the expert, that that's their job, right? And now we're telling them not so much. So Crystal, may I start with you on that one?
Sure. I'm going to probably be a little bit controversial. I will just say that I think it's really important to be very self-aware in these roles as staff people. And when I talk about expertise, I am also shifting how we define that word. I think most of my life, I've worked in philanthropy for over 30 years. What expertise has been defined as is high degrees from elite institutions. The old model when I first came into philanthropy was that, most foundation presidents used to be college or university presidents, and then they sort of just shifted over to philanthropy. And that's not the kind of staff leadership that I'm talking about with expertise. I am actually talking about people who have lived experience on the issues that are being addressed by the foundations. I'm talking about hiring staff that are more reflective of the communities in which we live. I'm talking about being much more, as you said, Melissa, proximate, and having that kind of staff who are there. If you are not that, thinking about hiring more of those folks. If you have not gotten those and you are, in a legacy organization in which that's not perhaps a possibility, then I think some of the tools that we're seeing that are very useful can be things like participatory grant making and having other people make decisions. So one of the examples I would give, we started the Democracy Frontlines Fund after the summer racial awakening of what I refer to as the George Floyd awakening. And what that really was is we created a pooled fund. We have now 15 foundations participating, $45 million going to a slate of 10 Black-led organizing groups. And those organizations were selected by a brain trust of women of color who make grants to Black-led organizing groups and have about a collective 100-year experience doing that work. Because even though even at Libra, we have a staff that are very reflective, we did not have a staff that was laser focused only on Black-led organizing. And that's really what Democracy Frontlines Fund was focused on. So we pulled together people who were actually able to make better decisions than we were and give them the authority to make those decisions about what that slate looked like. So I think it's really important when we think about these transitions to really place front and center our own self-awareness of who we are and what our strengths and limitations are, pulling in people who don't look exactly like us in this field, because that's not who's been sitting at decision-making roles. And, and really thinking about how we reshape what philanthropy looks like in decision-making in a way that upends the power dynamics that have been at play for so long that have really ossified kind of what philanthropy, we have to flow more. We have to free the money. We have to be part of community decision-making. This is, we have had this very stuck, decision-making. And I think that's partly why we've not seen the change that we want to see. And yet, when we were more open, when we were more free, when we were willing to admit that we didn't know and that our hearts were broken, which was really what defined 2020, both through COVID and through the horrific murder of George Floyd. That's when I think we as a country were at our best, right? We actually stood up and said, Black Lives Matter, no more. Across the country, white people, Black people, brown people, Asian folks, we all said that. And we felt unified in that. So I think that's where we can remember who we are at our best selves, come back to those moments. And that's really when philanthropy the power of the money is the way in which it flows, as Don said, authentically. It flows, as Angelique said, from community members who are, this Gen Z who are like, no, we're not just taking the old answers. We got new answers, right? So I think that's what's exciting to me about this work.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate these points. And I think in particular, thinking about what is the path through life that some of our colleagues have had is a very deep part of that. So Don, how do you see that in your organization?
Well, what Crystal said really resonates with me. I think self-awareness is the first phrase that you use. That's absolutely essential. And I think that goes a long way. But Melissa, I also want to be a little controversial here, because I think that the field of philanthropy, or at least the part of the field that we're in, we're more of the social justice philanthropy, part of the sector. I think there's a lot of discussion about power, about seeding power, shifting power, sharing power. Those are all great things, but I personally would love to have a more in-depth strategic conversation about power with as many people as we can possibly get. Because if you think about these notions of seeding and shifting power, it does begin with an assumption that philanthropy is powerful. And there's no question that we are. Foundations are powerful in a certain sense. We have money, we have influence, undue influence, etc. And at the same time, we have just a whole set of horrible challenges before us. We have a rise of white nationalism. We have, we had an insurrection attempt a couple of years ago. We've had just this year over 460 bills that are targeting LGBTQ plus people in state legislatures. You name it. There are huge challenges, and I would argue that we're all not powerful enough. And so I think about Edgar Villanueva's his exhortation to us, which is, how can we, and not necessarily just philanthropy, but all of us, how can we use our power so that we can all be powerful together? Right. And so, if we can think about that and ask ourselves, what role can philanthropy play? I think in the sense that we're discussing, the relationship between funders and grantees, I think absolutely shifting power not only is very principled, but it's super pragmatic, because you're going to get solutions that are ground tested, that are really well understood by communities, and also solutions that are developed at the community level, at the movement level, that have a greater likelihood of succeeding than those that are hatched in a boardroom somewhere. And at the same time, I think we need to be much more intentional about coming together to build power, to foster social change towards a just society. And that, I think, we're falling short on.
Right. That is the role of influence and voice. That's a different way to talk about power. Very important. Thank you for that. I'm going to come back to the power topic in a minute, but Angelique, I want to give you a chance to say something about how this change at Skillman is redefining roles and of the program team.
I feel like I'm, at church right now. There's so much like testifying going on here. What I'll say is we are a BIPOC foundation. The majority of folks that work at Skillman, our executive team, our board, we are folks of color. We are in a city that is majority folks of color. And we also acknowledge that we have all internalized racism and bias. And so even being folks of color, we have a lot of learning and unlearning that we need to do. that philanthropy does have power. We are formidable. We can release information or not release information. We are not neutral. We can show up at a table or not show up at a table. What we speak, when we don't speak, all of it carries such weight. We are really in the influence business after all. So when we are rethinking every piece of the foundation, policies, practices, decision-making, dollars spent, we are just in the middle of it. You know, we removed the officer title from our roles, and understanding that that has a connotation that is actually not at all what we do. We are not about monitoring or compliance or some of the other negative connotations that come from policing, as you mentioned, Crystal, and I was just in Montgomery a week ago. That the program staff is actually not in charge of creating strategy. They're doing that. They're co-creating, they're co-designing their strategies. Our youth power strategy, we did a scan with the Funders Collaborative for youth organizing and looked at all of the youth organizers in Southeast Michigan, have an advisory committee of young people who are creating that grant making strategy, similar to our educator power. We are talking to educators about what that grant making strategy should be. We've just hired our first VP of Learning and Impact so that we can co-create what are realistic metrics that we might have on this work. And in our communications team, we hired a social change storyteller who is actually really more about lifting stories, connecting ideas, redefining in real time who gets to be the expert. So our program staff, they are yentas. They are gardeners, they are doulas, they are liaisons, but they are not officers and they are not experts. They are moving capital and connecting ideas.
Great. Thank you. Thank you to all three of you for that. I want to ask about how you are balancing in your leadership roles, both internally and externally, the inevitable tension between a path of building the capacity of the leaders, organizations, and communities that you care about with the urgency of now. Capacity building is not a fast thing. Systems change is not a fast thing, but even though the intensity of the moment that Crystal mentioned in 2020 has kind of dissipated in some ways, there is a powerful sense of, that many of us have about urgency and speed and making a difference now. And how do you help people understand that you're trying to make the money flow more smoothly and swiftly, but that the kind of change that you're enabling is not like technical term. So I'm going to start with you this time, Don, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, it's a really good question. I think the Cerna Foundation has always taken the long view and played the long game, in the sense that we have supported systems change. We have focused on addressing root causes, and we recognize that things take time to change, systems take time to change. And if you look at the historical injustices and inequities that dominate the field, actually providing capacity, supporting leadership development, enabling organizations to be able to provide good health care for their staff, to enable them to take, vacation and doing all the things, professional development. That's an urgent task that, we're making up for lost time. So many shoestring organizations have been under-resourced for so long, especially in communities of color and for people of color-led organizations, that it's long overdue. And so we're making up for, lost time and bad habits. And so I feel that that's really urgent. And the second part of, my thought on this is the organizations, the movement partners, the networks that we work with, they have a really good sense of how to respond to immediate challenges or opportunities, such as $4 trillion in federal spending that's coming down on things like infrastructure and renewable energy. They're on it. And at the same time, they're not necessarily asking us to help them do that. They're also asking us to help them build their capacity so that they can have a better workplace, so they can attract talented staff, so they can retain staff. So I feel like, they know best about how to, prioritize and figure out how to balance capacity with the acute needs of today. And it's been our stance for a while.
This, by the way, is sadly the last question that you'll have to answer, because not surprisingly, we're out of time and I have a million more questions, and so does our audience. So go, Crystal.
So I would, I love what I'll pick up, Don, on what you just shared about network intelligence. We really try to fund ecosystems of organizations. So one of the key ways that we find new grantees, because Libra does not accept unsolicited grant proposals, we are a tiny staff at a national foundation. And so we just can't, we really made a clear decision that the role of the program team is not to weed through applications. The role of the program team is actually to be in partnership and relationship with the existing grantees. We ask our existing grantees, what other organizations could you not do your work without? Like, who else is out there that is really critically important to building on the work? Who do you think with? Who do you work with? Who do you move with? And so we're trying to fund ecosystems of organizations. They nominate and recommend other organizations, and that's actually how we build our pipeline. We give long-term, multi-year support to our organizations. Our grants right now are only 2 years, but we're in long-term relationships where where our grantees know that renewal is pretty much guaranteed. And so we're going to continue to work with them. If they're not going to be renewed, we tell them at the beginning of their, next 2 to 3 year grant, so that they know that that's what's going to happen when they're going to get phased out. We really, and that's very rare, by the way. So, it's very important to give general operating support grants. To Don's point about organizations being able to be able to adapt and shift and make changes in order to respond to the urgency of now, right? They have to have the resources to make those decisions. A few years ago, our program team was hearing that staffs were overwhelmed, they were exhausted, that executive directors were struggling with how to really support their staff members. So we gave 2-year grants, $50,000 each organization, so $25,000 a year of capacity building dollars to all of our grantees that had budgets below $5 million. And, that was just so that they could take those resources. Some of them, increased staff pay. Some of them increased their vacation time. Some of them got coaches for their senior leadership team. Some of them used it to really research and get better benefits for their staff members. It's all of those resources that we know that you have to have in order to be able to build a long-term organization that can move. And I do think that there is something very powerful in your question too, Melissa, about going slow to go fast. There is this statement that, we use, and our grantees say, nothing about us without us, that comes out of the disability rights movement. And it is very powerful and it is very important. It takes time to build consensus. It takes time to build trust. It takes time to get to know each other as human beings, not just as human doings. So we have to be willing to invest in that time with our organizations, with our grantee partners, and say to them, we know that you're going to be able to do more powerful long-term work because you're taking the time to build those relationships right now. So that's what we see as being really important about this urgency as well as long-term strategy. They're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah,
And
great.
so we have to see it that way.
Great, thank you, thank you. Angelique.
I didn't know if we had time. I was going to suggest you just give me a chapter in your upcoming book and then.
I'll give you a chapter of the upcoming book, no question.
Okay.
All of you, and thank you. I don't want to impose on anybody's time even more than we have already. Angelique, you mentioned it felt like being in church. There's a chorus of amens in the Q&A, along with thank yous and appreciation, all of which my colleagues and I share. I look forward to being in contact with all of you again soon. Thank you. Bye.